Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and today we're going to talk about the SeeAudio Yume. But before we do, this episode is brought to you by the t-shirt High Res Placebo. Get yours today via a link in the description below. All right, enough shilling. Let's go ahead and talk about the Yume, which if you missed my unboxing a couple of weeks ago, I'll just give you a little bit of background on this. So this is around a $170 IM. It is a hybrid, so it's got a dynamic driver for the low end as well as two balanced armatures for the mid-range and the treble. They're both Knowles drivers if you care, and well, that's not too uncommon in this price range. What is somewhat uncommon is that SeeAudio has a very particular frequency response target that they were after, and they specifically call out they were trying to tune this IM to the Harman target. Now, if you don't inherently know what that means, we'll talk a little bit about it as we talk about the sound of this earphone. But look, this is a review and we're gonna get to talking about the sound, but we're also gonna talk about the build quality, the accessories and stuff that it comes with. But yeah, I've just been living with this earphone for the past couple of weeks and comparing it to some other competitors in its price range. And I'm ready to let you know what I think. And if you're watching right now live and you have any questions about the Yume that I don't answer, at the end of this review, we're gonna have a little kind of back and forth Q&A. So hit me up with questions in the live chat. And if you're watching and it's not live, you're watching the VOD, I'm sorry you missed out. But if you wanna subscribe to the channel and ding the bell, YouTube will let you know next time I'm live, and then you can be part of the conversation. But for now, let's talk about the SeeAudio Yume. I'm tempted to make some Yume jokes, like, you may call me Mark Ryan if you'd like, but I'm not gonna do that unless that counts right there. Anyway, this is a SeeAudio Yume, and before we start, just a quick shout out to Hi-Fi Go. It's a retailer that sent this earphone to me for review. This is not a sponsored review, like all of my reviews, but they did send it to me for free. Anyway, so here's what you get inside the box of the Yume. Not too atypical for what you get in most $170 IEMs, but we'll go through it real quickly. So you get a pretty big selection of tips, and maybe the one outstanding thing here, or the one difference here, is that you get a bunch of these foam tips, and for some reason they're all the same size, which is curious, but I've got 4 different pairs of those foam tips. You also get, your typical silicone tips, but maybe it's not fair to call these things typical. So the medium sizes, all right, that looks fairly typical. But for some reason, the small sizes are kind of these weird, let's pull them into frame, these weird like barrel shapes. This is the extra small, and then I've got the small ones on the Yume, and they're both kind of that weird barrel shape, which is interesting. You also do get a set of stickers, which is a little bit atypical. And then you get this little carrying case, which this is actually one of my favorite forms of a carrying case that IEMs can come in. It's fairly compact. It seems to be made out of some sort of metal, but even if it's just a plastic, and frankly I'm not certain, maybe it is just a plastic, but I don't know. I think this sort of carrying case is, I'm not using it because I use my little stupid plastic boxes, but that is one of my favorite types of carrying cases to come with an earphone. Then of course you get a cable and you get an IEM, which is going to lead us into talking about the build quality of the IEM specifically. We'll start just by talking about the aesthetics of this thing, which frankly I think is pretty attractive, although, and this is kind of coming across on camera, frankly, the design is kind of just oddly dark. If you get it right, you can get the light to shine and show the pattern that's there, but it's really kind of surprisingly dark, and that, carries through not just here in camera, but in person. I don't know that that matters necessarily. And I also, I actually really like this cable, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in detail, but I do think that aesthetically it's kind of a bit of a mismatch for the Yume. I don't know, just my personal opinion. But the shells themselves, they're made pretty well. Sort of a fairly typical acrylic shell, which again, I can't remember if this is filled in or hollow. It seems to be a little bit hollow, and they are a little bit on the light side, which can be a good thing or a bad thing, I suppose, kind of depending on your preferences. I usually like a little bit more weight just to make it feel like I got my money's worth, but that's a pretty stupid reason to want that. It doesn't change my mind, but there you go. But it is cool that you can look inside and see the parts inside the IM. You can see the dynamic driver right there. You can see the balanced armatures right up here, and then you can see the inner tubing, which I think is pretty nice. So generally pretty attractive. The other things about this, the buds that I'm going to talk about, is the general shape of them, which is, I think, a very opinionated shape, which is, you know, sort of thing that you can get with a balanced armature set like this, is you get this, you know, pretty almost custom style curvature to the ear fit, which means that if this fits your ear, you're going to get a really secure fit. It's going to be nice and sort of tight and locked in there. But there's a chance that it might not fit your ear that great. For me, it actually fit pretty well, and generally I found these things super secure. The only real issue that I had with the comfort of the Yume is that these nozzles are a little bit on the long side, and I don't know if that necessarily comes across here on camera, but I did have some issues with the length, which is why I'm actually using these small tips when I typically will wear a medium. Let's go ahead and do a quick fit test here on camera just to prove to you that these things fit inside my ears. But yeah, generally isolation I would say is about average, maybe, yeah, I would say it's about average, maybe slightly above average. And again, it's just a really very secure fit, provided it will fit inside your ears. There is also, we'll talk about this, let's go punch in here and look at the cable. There's a chin slider, which is one of the more functional chin sliders. I like it, right? This thing is not moving around on its own. It stays in place. I dig it. I did mention that I like this cable, despite the color maybe not being the best match for the color on the buds, but it is a very, frankly, pretty nice cable. It's a little bit on the thick side, but it's nice and soft, very pliable. And I'll go ahead and wind it up here to show you how well behaved this cable is. You can see the Yume just stacks up here on its cable quite nicely. It's got a little bit of a gummy texture. It kind of reminds me of a cable that came with, what was it, the Fiio? I don't think I know how to pronounce that correctly. But yeah, generally pretty happy with the cable of this thing. And that, I think, is gonna wrap up my notes on the build of the SeeAudio Yume. So let's go ahead and talk about the sound of this earphone. And like I mentioned in sort of the introduction, SeeAudio is going for a Harman target, going for the Harman target. And if you're not familiar with what that is, basically any sort of audio transducer, earphone, right, is going to produce a frequency response that sort of indicates where its sort of emphases are, right? Is it very bassy? Is it very trebly? Does it have goofy mid-range? And that frequency response you can kind of chart out as sort of a line on a graph. And if you've seen my unboxing videos, you've seen what these graphs look like. The Harman target is basically just an attempt to establish what is the ideal tuning. Now, I don't think, I'm not a big fan of saying that this is what the optimal target frequency response is, but I don't really have any beef with the Harman target. I think it generally approaches what most people would call sort of a neutral sound signature, but with enough bass on it to not be boring. I think most people, when they hear neutral, probably think boring bass. And Harman target is kind of like the solution to that. It's neutral, but with some sub-bass emphasis. And that's exactly what the SeeAudio Yume does. We proved it with the frequency response, and I can say that from listening to it, yeah, it hits that target. Well, let's talk a little bit more about this thing. So, maybe some notes on the Harman target. Again, I mentioned it's neutral with some bass. You could argue, and some people would argue, that it's a little bit thin in the mid-range. Maybe the mid-range doesn't have a ton of body to it like you might get on a warmer sounding IM, and frankly, I get that. I don't, this is again where the Harman target is not necessarily my ideal tuning, but I'm perfectly happy with the Harman tuning. The Moondrop Blessing 2 is pretty similar tune to the SeeAudio Yume here, and we know that the Moondrop Blessing 2 is an earphone I like quite a bit. But you could say it's a little bit thin in the mid-range. And then while it does have a fairly significant bass shelf to it, fairly significant emphasis in the sub-bass frequencies to make it plenty satisfactory. I don't think you would call this a bassy IM. So if you're looking for a bassy IM, I would look at something else. But yeah, I just think that, you know, this target is generally pretty good for most people, which is exactly what the Harman target was meant to be. It wasn't necessarily meant to be the final word on neutral. It wasn't necessarily meant to be the final word, the only way that you can ever tune a thing, but it's meant to be the recipe that's going to most likely appeal to people. And I think that's a pretty good way to talk about the tuning of the Yume. So let's talk about the strengths of listening to this thing, or so the strengths of the sound quality, right? So the tonal aspect of it, the tonal balance, I think is frankly pretty excellent. There's not a lot under $200 that really does this better. So if you're just looking for a great frequency response, for 170 bucks, I mean, you can go with some of the Etymotic stuff, which isn't exactly the same frequency response here, but they're targeting a slightly different thing. And I think what Etymotic does, like, they hit their target as well as the Yume hits its target. You know, what that effect is that, you know, the tonality of vocals and stuff just comes across very natural here on the Yume. I think that, you know, the treble doesn't have any goofy dips and dives. It just generally, it sounds pretty good. It's not overly aggressive, not overly forward, but cymbals still have, you know, a decent amount of detail, and they sound like cymbals, which frankly is important. The bass, I think, on the Yume here is also pretty well extended. You do get that dynamic driver delivering a decent amount of texture into it. It's not, again, a bassy IM, but I think there is plenty of bass here for most folks. And I think it's fairly well integrated, you know, given that this is a hybrid IM. But I gotta also talk about some of the things that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of when it comes to the sound of the Yume. So let's talk about what I think are some of its weaknesses. Tonally excellent, yes, but frankly, I find its sort of stereo imaging, right? It's sort of, its ability to create sort of a 3D depth and effect to it, a little bit lacking here on the Yume. And frankly, as much as I like the tonal balance of this earphone, that just kind of made this a little bit on the boring side for me to listen to. It's just not especially strong in stereo imaging. Just comes across a little bit two-dimensional. I think probably about on par with something like the Tin Hi-Fi T4, if you've heard that, which is not a bad sounding IM by any stretch of the imagination. It's just a little bit dull. And then treble and mid-range detail here on the Yume, I found a little bit lackluster, especially when you start listening to like tracks that are fairly busy in that frequency range, right? So some examples, and this might not be an artist you're very familiar with, but Drab Majesty. Check out some of their music. They create a lot of sound, and it's, you know, a lot of it's going to fall into the mid-range. And when you're listening to it here on the Yume, in my opinion, it's just the details in the mid-range just kind of get a little bit smeary. Seems like a little bit of a harsh word, but frankly, that's kind of the gist that I get. So that is the SeeAudio Yume. I was going to go ahead and talk about it a little bit compared to the Fiio FH3, which is also a 3-driver hybrid, right? Basically the exact same configuration, single dynamic driver, 2 Knowles balanced armatures. I don't know if they're actually using the exact same Knowles balanced armatures, but very, very similar in terms of their construction. This is 130 bucks, so actually a little bit cheaper than the Yume. But I thought it was worth comparing these two. I think tonally they're fairly different. Like the Fiio is a bassier IM, frankly. It's a little bit warmer tune, maybe quite a bit warmer tune, but interestingly, even though the FH3 has got quite a bit of bass, it somehow doesn't really at all sacrifice mid-range detail, and that's where I frankly still prefer listening to the FH3. I think that the FH3 just does staging and stereo imaging much stronger than the Yume. The detail in the mid-range I think is much stronger here on the Fiio, and I don't know, I think in the treble region it might sound a little bit more detailed on the FH3, but you could also describe it as slightly on the grainy side, which I don't think is an issue that the Yume has. So if you're sensitive to treble issues, you might actually prefer the Yume. And again, just the tonal balance on the Yume is quite good, but I just don't think that it really holds up to the FH3 in terms of that depth. And frankly, as much as I like the frequency response here of the Yume, I feel like that depth in the audio is probably my favorite thing about sound. So out of 5 stars, I'm gonna go ahead and give the SeeAudio Yume a very solid 3 stars. I think this is a pretty solid IEM for the price. Again, tonal balance, pretty excellent, not really anything I can complain about. Build quality and fit, pretty solid, provided you can get a small enough tip to go into your ear canals. It's just that listening to it, frankly, I find a little bit on the unengaging side. Is it a bad IEM? Not at all. I think this is a very nice sounding IEM. I just find it a little bit less engaging than something like the Fiio FH3, and so, well, that's where we land at 3 stars. But if you're interested in checking out the SeeAudio Yume, of course I got a link in the description down below, and while you're down there, if you found this video informative, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you're not already, ding the YouTube bell. YouTube will let you know next time I'm live, and then I'll see you on the next super review. Cheers, guys.